In the distant and dystopian year of 2019, we see a man named Joe, who just got out of his Nissan brand flying car to pick up his daily allowance of Berkeley station food, before heading off to work with his corporate overlords who now own the entire west coast of the United States ever since Japan took over the world. But something feels off. Joe gets a sudden feeling that the Japanese economy collapsed in the 90s, and Japan didn't take over the world. Now that he thinks about it, that lamp in the corner looks kinda weird. The realization hits. Joe isn't real, and his entire reality is a rhetorical device invented by a random YouTuber to prove a point. Why? He screams. Well, I'm glad you asked, Joe. When looking at media in the cyberpunk genre, you may have spotted that Japanese influence is highly prevalent, sometimes in subtle ways and others more explicitly. While you could chalk it up to Japan having a cool aesthetic, there is actually a far more interesting story behind it. Following the end of World War II, the Japanese economy entered a period of rapid growth as the government invested heavily in new technologies and building up industry to make up for their massive losses during the war and begin recovering. This widespread economic success would affect millions of people even outside of Japan, as Japanese products became increasingly common overseas and Japanese brands became some of the most recognizable in the world, leaving a lasting impact on popular culture that can be felt to this day. Although to fully understand how exactly it impacted our culture and what this has to do with cyberpunk, we must go back a few years. Western fears of the Orient have existed for centuries, and some examples can be seen across history. For example, back in the Middle Ages, Genghis Khan and his Mongol Empire were used as easy examples of barbaric and unstoppable forces to the east that threatened the way of life of the Christian European kingdoms. More recently, we could see a prime form of this yellow peril in the 1870s, when white American laborers in California pushed for discrimination of Chinese immigrants who had been arriving to the area in large numbers in search for a better life ever since the California Gold Rush of 1848, scaring the white population who feared losing their jobs and livelihoods to these hordes of immigrants. Sounds familiar. Anyways, this led to a lot of hate crimes directed against the Chinese and culminated in the Chinese explosion, which, as the name implies, excluded the Chinese from further immigrating to the US. As the years went by, however, yellow peril fears started to shift away from China and towards Japan, a rapidly modernizing and industrializing imperial power comparable to those of the West, that had repeatedly shown its capacity to stand up to European powers while building their own empire and committing countless atrocities along the way, like every good empire. Stoking fears of an Asiatic empire eclipsing them and conquering parts of the US to subjugate them for their own interests, reaching their peak after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the Second World War, where they proceeded to kick Japan's ass. And now we are back to the unprecedented post-war economic growth known as the Japanese economic miracle. At first, the United States was very supportive of this resurgent Japan, as it had been brought up by their post-war administration. They had written the constitution and they could use Japan as a shining example of a country seemingly prospering and developing under capitalism, which was especially important within the context of the recently started Cold War and the two countries became close allies, temporarily subduing yellow peril rhetoric. Nonetheless, in the 70s and 80s, as the Japanese economy began to approach that of the US and seemed likely to surpass it, yellow peril fears resurfaced yet again. Japanese manufacturers were outproducing their American counterparts, and Japanese imports were competing with domestic producers. People in the auto industry had begun to complain about unfair competition with the Japanese, and the heat trends were once again being committed on Asian Americans. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the United States trade deficit with Japan doubled from $10 billion to $50 billion, and there was an increasing sense that Japan would inevitably dominate the US and the world through their economic might. And throughout the 1980s, multiple books were published forecasting the coming rise of Japan, as an increasing number of Americans believed that it was Japan and not the Soviet Union that was the real enemy, further encouraged by the collapse of the Eastern Bloc after 1989. It is within this context that we can begin to analyze the science fiction of the era. Techno-Orientalism is the term generally used to describe the prevailing depictions of East Asia as the name implies, highly advanced, technological, and overdeveloped land, which is both strong enough to dominate the world and a mysterious and exotic other to overwhelmingly white and Western protagonist. One of the most notable examples of the trope is the film Blade Runner, released in 1982 to medium financial and critical success before later reanalysis turned it into a cult classic as people praise the film's themes of what it means to be human. The film takes place in a futuristic Los Angeles, which is shown to have developed into a hyper-dense, polluted, and overpopulated monstrosity, with a lot of inspiration taken from Asian cities such as Tokyo and Hong Kong. Meant to look highly technological, yet crowded and miserable, the development of a major city gone wrong. One of the first impressive displays of futurism we see in the film is a giant advertisement screen showing a Japanese geisha advertising an unknown product. Throughout the movie, we can see many different Asian characters in the backdrop of the film, performing essential tasks like preparing food for our main character, translating between the predominantly Asian dialect of the lower class and English, and manufacturing the components for the replicant androids that are at the center of our narrative. And yet, there remains an air of resentment that they are necessary at all, as their presence and the implied power of their motherlands must have come at the cost of the white festivals our protagonist embodies and their previous global dominance. The legacy of Blade Runner as a sci-fi classic alongside the resurgent fears of the Orient overtaking the West through superior technology and business practices have left a lasting impact on science fiction and their perception of the future to this day. I will now proceed to list some of my favorite examples. In the Alien franchise, there exists a vastly powerful megacorporation named Weyland Yutani, implied to be the product of a merger between a Western and a Japanese company. In the Star Wars prequels, of all things, we are introduced to the main audience, a species of wealthy hyper-capitalistic aliens whose clothes take inspiration from traditional East Asian wear and speaking caricatures of Asian accents, who embody the stereotype of opportunistic and scheming Japanese business, seeking nothing but to further their wealth and influence, which to be fair applies to most rich people. In Cyberpunk 2077, one of the most powerful megacorporations is called Arasaka. It is ruthless, unlike evil, and evidently Japanese, treated as an extension of Japan itself and even tied to the Japanese organized crime group known as the Yakuza. The Yakuza itself is often expanded across the world in settings in which Japan takes over the world with technological and economic might, and represents many of the worst aspects of Japanese domination. And yet, despite all the forecasts of inevitable Japanese domination, it all came crashing down as speculation in the stock market rose far beyond reality, developing into a bubble that was ready to pop in the early 1990s, and, coupled with poor government policies, the ensuing financial crash wrecked the Japanese economy, entering what is now known as the Lost Decade, a period in which Japanese economic growth has drastically slowed down, which continues today. In the current days, fears of a resurgent Orient which will economically dominate everyone else have been steadily moving towards China, and we may see a similar reaction in pop culture in the years to come. But as of now, the legacy of the Japanese economic miracle lives on in the cyberpunk genre, where Japanese futurism still dominates. And that's why you exist, Joe. I wanted to use you as a narrative device to talk to people on the internet about how Japanese economic success, coupled with some fear-mongering and speculation, have impacted science fiction. And if you, random person on the internet, like this video, consider subscribing and all that stuff if you'd like to see me talk more about random things I find interesting in the future.